This week on the Communicators, a discussion on how states and localities are viewing provisions in the House and Senate stimulus bills for broadband expansion. Sharon Gillet is an official with the state of Massachusetts, and Joanne Hovis is with the National Association of Telecommunications Officers and Advisors.
As the House and the Senate debate the stimulus package, one portion of that includes money that would be used for broadband services in states across the nation. That's the topic of our Communicators program for today. Joining us, we have two different perspectives, one representing a state perspective, one representing a local perspective. Our guest, our Commissioner Sharon Gillet. She is the Commissioner for the Massachusetts Department of Telecommunications and Cable. And also joining us in the conversation today, Joanne Hovis of the National Association of Telecommunications Officers and Advisors. She serves as a board member for that organization. To both of you, thanks for coming by.
Thanks for having us.
And joining us also in the conversation is Jeff Silva. He is the Washington Bureau Chief of RCR Wireless News, and we'll be asking questions of our guests as well. Mr. Silva, welcome.
Thanks for having me.
To both of you ladies, can we start by saying that both sides have a version, or at least a vision, for broadband deployment, at least as far as money is concerned? The House has a figure, the Senate has a figure. Could you talk about what that figure means to you, coming from your various perspectives, looking at a state and looking at a locality? And Commissioner Gillet, we'll start with you.
Sure. Well, the Senate version has a $9 billion total. At least that was yesterday. It's changing by the minute. And the House has a $6 billion total. So there are so many worthy broadband projects out there. Obviously, more is better. And we'll see what happens in conference, or we'll see what happens when the Senate gets through with it.
As far as a figure is concerned, I know that there are a lot of figures being talked about. What do you think about those figures as they ended up at being $6 and $9 billion, as far as the dollar amounts are concerned?
Well, I think we should focus on the most positive piece here, which is, first of all, there are 9 zeros after the figure, whatever it is, and that's a recognition of how important broadband is nationwide. The figure is not zero. That's what it's been for the last 20 years of broadband policy. It's been that the government had no role in this, and what we're seeing now is that there is a big public role in broadband, and so any figure with billions after for a nationwide policy, we figure is an improvement over a zero figure.
Ms. Hovis, so what do you think about the figure and the government, and what it says about the government's interest in this?
I totally agree with Sharon. This is a really important statement on the part of the government that broadband matters and that there is a role for the United States government and for states and for localities and for the private sector in solving this enormous problem we have in our country, which is that we've fallen behind in broadband. And the dollar amount of both could be higher, could be lower. We are satisfied that it's a statement that something needs to be done, and we think that that amount of money, whether it's 6 or 9 billion, will go a long way to start us on the road to getting back to where we need to be, which is at the forefront of the world in broadband.
So whatever the figure, it's more than a symbol, really, about this issue?
It's a sign. It establishes a key principle, and it puts the government's money where its mouth is, and saying that this kind of infrastructure is important, that this is essential to the future of our economy and the way our society functions and the quality of our democracy. We've all been saying this for a long time, but we've never before had a serious financial commitment from the United States government in that regard, and that's what we're seeing now. So we are very pleased. We think it reflects a recognition of incredibly important things about how the United States should go forward.
Mr. Silva.
It's very interesting in the entire debate on the economic stimulus. What has come up is what the money is being spent on and how fast it could create jobs and economic growth. The Congressional Budget Office recently scored both bills, economic stimulus, and their findings were that the spending, a lot of it, on both bills, the dollars would not be spent, much of it, until between 2012, 2016. It'd be interesting to hear how the broadband dollars that would go to states and localities would create jobs, would stimulate economic growth, that being the prime objective of the legislation.
Well, I think it would help to understand some specific projects that are actually going on in states and localities today to put some flesh on your question. In Massachusetts, Governor Patrick signed legislation in August which authorized up to $40 million in state-issued bond funding to stimulate private sector investment in broadband to cover the entire state. We had, at that time, 32 communities in almost all of them in western Massachusetts, which is rural and mountainous the Berkshire Mountain region, which had no consumer-grade broadband, no cable, no DSL. Can you imagine what it's like to live in a community where you can't log in quickly? Nobody could do it. And they were very frustrated, and they were letting the legislature know. And the governor took quite a bit of leadership, Governor Patrick, to ensure that there would be adequate funding to co-invest. So the model in Massachusetts is a public-private partnership model with co-investment. So the public sector invests bond funding in hard assets with long lifetimes, things that the capital for them would be prohibitive in a small community to afford. So things like fiber backbones or wireless towers. And the private sector would then co-invest to be the service provider. The state would not be the service provider. The private sector would create a business opportunity for the private sector. That's a model that's signed into law. The funding is authorized. We can go ahead with that. And if we were able to access stimulus funds on top of it, we'd be able to make quick use of expanding to more people or doing a higher grade of service. There are many different things we could do. On top of that, there's all sorts of times where, for example, when you open a road, it's crazy in this day and age. Every time you open a road, you ought to make sure there's a conduit there for telecommunications. And so to the extent that other projects in stimulus, some of these projects involving hard infrastructure could also take a while. But typically the broadband component of them is much faster and much less expensive than the other traditional forms of infrastructure.
How soon or how many jobs have you projected if you were to get a piece of the broadband funding? Have you projected how many jobs or quantified what sort of economic stimulus it would provide to the state?
Well, we've been operating on our state funding model. We're not counting any chickens at this point in terms of federal funds, although they would certainly be nice. But on our package, we've been looking at it in terms of, first of all, job creation, but also government efficiencies. So one figure that I can share with you is that some of our state agencies, they require, for example, sharing of financial data with the towns. And they would like to move all to online filing of that financial data. But we had some number of towns, again, mostly in western Massachusetts, that can't afford the telecommunications infrastructure. They can't buy commercial grade broadband. They'd have to buy special circuits. One town was quoted a price of $27,000 to run a special circuit so that their town hall could get connected to file these forms. And it's prohibitive. So the state agency has to maintain two different sets of operating procedures, one for online and one for not. And they estimated that they could save $300,000 a year if they didn't have to do that. And that's one agency. The state is enormous. So I think there are huge savings to be had in addition to the job creation and any stimulus effects that could come.
What about on the local level? Where do you see the job creation and the economic stimulus there?
We see enormous impact in two ways. One is immediate, as the dollars get spent in a community and create jobs, and the other one, which is the real driver for why we build broadband in the first place, is that broadband itself becomes a stimulator of economic activity and a multiplier of economic activity down the road. But to take the first category, which I think is what the stimulus bill is primarily concerned with, there is an immediate impact in terms of creating jobs. One of the reasons we like the bill, particularly some principles that it establishes, is that it speaks of broadband, particularly the House bill recognizes broadband, big broadband, as a high bandwidth infrastructure. We need much bigger broadband than we have in the United States right now, something comparable to what's being deployed in our competitor nations in Asia and in Europe. And what that means is that we have to build fiber optics. To go out and build fiber optics is traditional infrastructure. We dig up roads, we take fiber across bridges, we take it through tunnels, we take it along ditches, we string it up on poles, and that immediately creates jobs. There's not a long lead time for doing that kind of work either. So in the local government community, we have identified a lot of projects where communities have done a lot of planning, and there's such a pent-up demand for this kind of project that many of them are ready to issue purchase orders within 30 days to private sector companies to begin construction. Then beyond the construction, then there's also operations and maintenance of the network. And of course, there's also provision of the equipment, manufacture of the equipment, manufacture of the fiber. That's all the immediate job creation stimulus. And if it helps to have a number, I can tell you we did an analysis for a mid-sized city where a stimulus grant could incentivize significantly more local public sector investment and possibly private sector investment. Our analysis with respect to deployment of that fiber optic network, which would be a fiber to the home and business network, was that in the first 3 years of the construction, it would create 1,200 jobs per year in construction, and then beyond that there would be 400 jobs on an ongoing basis for operations and maintenance of the network, and that's just for the physical layer. On top of that, there would also be the service providers that would be enabled. And then the really big payoff of broadband is that second category I mentioned. All the economic activity that will then take place over that fiber, all of the competitive advantage it will give businesses and home-based businesses and people who want to work from home in the global economy on an ongoing basis for the next 40, 50, 100 years.
You know, in the campaign and also in his inaugural address, though, and more in a passing fashion, President Obama has called for universal broadband. And I think the broadband stimulus, the funding, has turned out to be smaller than what some people thought it would be. And this appears to be the first installment of what this administration wants to do on broadband. What do both of you, what would you like to see going forward beyond the stimulus package for broadband in terms of funding, in terms of policy?
Speaking from a local perspective, representing local communities, there are thousands of communities around the country that are frankly desperate for either for broadband in general or for bigger broadband than we currently have, because many of our current technologies are based on very old copper and coaxial wiring that just can't carry the kinds of speeds that we need for the future and that our competitor nations have. So from our standpoint, what we are really interested in is a national policy and a partnership between localities, states, and the federal government in which we say, we have this huge deficit, we've fallen behind our competitor nations over the past 8 or 10 years, and we have to catch up, and we have to do better than we're doing now. We need a policy going forward that ensures that our metropolitan areas will get very big broadband, not DSL, not cable modem, big broadband, the kinds of speeds they get in Tokyo and Singapore and Amsterdam, and that China is deploying, gigabit symmetrical, many, many times the speeds that we currently get, even in the most prosperous cities in the United States. And then we also need a solution for rural areas, because we can't leave rural America behind. The broadband is a mechanism by which rural America can participate in the global economy and enhance education and telemedicine and telehealth and all the other reasons that broadband matters. And that may have to be a different technology, because very big broadband, very high bandwidth fiber to the premises is a very costly matter, which is why the private sector is not currently delivering it in most of the country. But on the whole, if there is a relationship and a partnership at all levels of government and a commitment to see this done, there's no reason to think that the United States can't do it.
As a policy, some things I'd like to see from where I sit as a commissioner, many federal policies at the FCC affect what would follow on from this stimulus package. Let's say, for the sake of argument, that there's a grant program established, and there's a proposal in the Senate, for example, to have the NTIA be administering a grant program of about $8 billion. That's a wonderful start. But grants help with the CapEx. They help with the capital investment and all the big, heavy, long-lived pieces that are hard to afford up front. Once you get them in place, you still have to operate them, and people still have to buy the service. And those are two problems that fall under the FCC's bailiwick, because the cost of operations is a Universal Service Fund issue. The Universal Service Fund still remains targeted only to voice service, which seems very 20th century, I think we could say. And the adoption also, FCC, part of the Universal Service Fund, is the Lifeline program, which is, again, largely targeted towards voice. And I think we need to bring both those programs into the 21st century. I know it's been a real struggle at the FCC, many parties with many points of view, but the time has come, especially if this grant program deals with the capital expenditures, then getting the user side and getting the operational side fixed at the FCC would be enormously valuable.
You raise a good point, because though you're dealing with the stimulus package right now, a lot of policies that are relevant to broadband will in fact be dealt with by the Federal Communications Commission. And what I think I hear you saying is what some, actually a growing number of experts and stakeholders have said, which is broadband needs to be incorporated as an integral part of the Universal Service Fund, or reform, which is a process that's going on right now. Is that something that you and other state regulators around the country are looking at?
Well, absolutely. I mean, state regulators don't regulate broadband. It's a federal issue. So it's at the federal level where all of the transitions are taking place. And the transition that's happening is that the networks that are out there, they used to be phone networks. Now they're broadband networks, and they provide all the services. And that is a different regulatory environment than the one that the FCC grew up in, and it requires change, which is hard, but needs to be done.
Ms. Hovis, you spoke about partnerships in developing these. Because one of you represents a state and one of you represents a locality, for instance, if this money is managed to pass and grants start going out, who should best manage it? And is there a tension between whether states should manage it or localities should manage how money gets dispersed? And let me start with you.
You know, to Massachusetts' credit, I think they've developed a really impressive model where there is local input and there is state assistance and guidance and funding. There's a core local component to broadband, like all communications. When we look at these networks, we're thinking about local needs. The networks are going to serve, for example, libraries and schools and healthcare institutions and other government functions, as well as serving the public. And they're going to connect the public to all of those core institutions of their community. And that's why local decision-making and local input are so essential. The state is also a very important part of that, and frequently an important partner. I think in many places the state and locality are working together already very well, and I think that the bill reflects that both have a role. What I'm thrilled about is now we see that there's also a federal role.
And what would you add to that, Commissioner Gillet?
Well, I would add a couple of things. First of all, that you know, every area is different. There are some very urban areas where it really makes sense to do a locally based network. There are other areas where the communities have 300 people in them, and it may not, the economics may not make sense to take a purely local approach. And our initiative in Mass is targeted at very low population, low density areas, and it's taken a regional approach, and that's why the state has gotten involved, because the economics of each town doing their own thing when the towns were very small really did not add up. It was going to be about twice as expensive as doing a regional approach. So I would say every state is different, every community is different, and then the nice thing about the package that I have seen is it has quite a bit of flexibility built in as to what these grants might look like and who they might go to. States would be eligible, localities would be eligible, and that I think is very important, that all of those different models be accommodated, because there is no one-size-fits-all. The second point I would make is that both of the bills in Congress, both the House and the Senate version, do not grant the money directly to states or localities. They create federal agency jurisdiction over grant applications from states or localities. And the agency that we believe is best positioned to handle such a grant program would definitely be the NTIA. There's a squabble going on in Congress right now, I gather, over
about putting some of it in the Agriculture Department.
Putting some of it in the Agriculture Department. And the Agriculture Department has a program called the Rural Utility Service, which did great things in electricity and great things in telephone. The problem with broadband is it's very different from those models, and there's trying to do the same model that worked for telephone for broadband, which involves many different types of companies, many different types of technologies. It's like that old saying of trying to do what you did before and expect a different outcome. The RUS program has not solved our problem in Massachusetts. It's not well targeted to the kinds of rural areas that we have, which are served by large carriers, for example. We're not the only state saying that. So we would really be very, we want to make sure rural areas are served. We have our own rural areas. We want to make sure they get served. And we think the NTIA grant program would be flexible enough to serve all the rural areas as well as taking care of the other types of, for example, municipal deployments that might make sense in much more urban areas.
And one of the other debates, at least on the federal level, is the concept of an underserved area and an unserved area and who should get priority. In your views, how do you make that happen on your various levels? How do you determine who should get what first?
My opinion would be that when the grant applications come in, they should be judged on their merits of what is most feasible, what reflects serious business planning and engineering planning and stakeholder involvement, and which are the projects that are most likely to be successful, as opposed to we are going to single out only a small part of a state or a community and they will get priority. Our feeling on this is that the maximum flexibility on the part of the agency that has jurisdiction and that allocates the grant, and we don't have a strong opinion as to which one it should be, we just want to be sure that they are staffed up and ready to go, that they're efficient, that they know how to evaluate the technologies and the business plans and the merits of the grants so that this can happen very quickly and that the stimulus can start having an impact as quickly as possible in our communities.
We totally agree.
Mr. Silva.
Do you think there's a cost-benefit analysis that officials at the local level and state level have to consider? On the one hand, there's technologies, broadband technologies out there that have blazing speeds, although when you get to talk about unserved and underserved, you get into certainly rural areas, and from our reporting in our paper, advanced wireless technologies have been shown to reduce the capital cost. Is wireless technology part of the consideration in bringing broadband to sparsely populated areas? Where does that fit in?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, wireless is a lower cost technology for low density areas, so it's absolutely going to be part of the solution. But I agree with Joanne. Each project has to be judged on its merits, and each project is going to have to do its own cost benefit and its own understanding of what technologies are going to make sense. So yes, I agree. Wireless will be part of the solution. I did want to hit on your cost benefit point. One of the things we find is that one of the things we're so pleased about seeing the government stepping up and saying, yes, there is a federal government role in this, in making sure that we have universal broadband, is that broadband provides many benefits to society that are not captured by a private firm that provides the broadband. So economic theory would tell you under those circumstances, benefits to healthcare and benefits to education and benefits to all of us by having fewer cars on the road because people can telecommute. Those benefits aren't captured in the business calculus if you're purely making a private sector business case. And it's led to underinvestment, especially in areas where the return is not as obvious, which is typically rural areas, but not always. Sometimes it's very urbanized areas where the population is low income. So those returns are things we all want to capture as a society, as America, as a knowledge-based economy. And so when government puts their money into the picture, they can take those returns into account in the cost-benefit calculation in a way that a private firm cannot. And that's why we feel like the partnership model is so important, because we need the efficiencies of the private sector to build the systems, to operate them, to serve the public. We also need the public good to be taken into account in the calculations.
This might be an overlap of what this question, the answer might overlap part of your answer, but President Bush was criticized for not doing enough on broadband. He called for universal broadband by 2007. President Obama has called for universal broadband, hadn't put a date on it. One of the criticisms is that we need to have a national strategy, a national plan. The United States doesn't embrace industrial policy like some other countries that have been successful in broadband. How then does the federal government partner with cities, states, and communities to improve broadband penetration, the quality of service, and still keeping to its traditional values?
It's interesting you say that, because our Secretary of Economic Development submitted a comment to the transition team, and he said it's great. We said it's great that you're including broadband in the stimulus package. That's right, the right thing to be doing. But you know, this is new territory as to how does the government wade into the broadband market. It's mostly a private market, and that's worked very well in many ways, but not as well as all of us would like in some other ways. So how do we keep what's good about it while not while fixing what's not working about it? And in doing that, we identified 3 different areas that we could see, all of which were legitimate ways for government involvement. One was to focus on adoption. Is this about getting people to use broadband? Another is to focus on deployment, and this is largely the rural, underserved, unserved areas. And the third was to focus on quality, which is what Joanne is speaking of. Should they embrace a goal of, you know, so many megabits per second by such and such a year? And essentially what we said is all of those are valid goals, and it's just a question of how you balance between them. They all need to be taken into account.
And I would say, as a nation, we built railroads across the country. We electrified the entire United States. We built out a phone network before the rest of the world came anywhere close. We were doing this 100 years ago. We built a national highway system that was the foundation of economic growth for 50 years. And we don't have to call it industrial policy, but we need a coherent vision of how we build the infrastructure of the 21st century. And based on our history as a country, there's no reason to think that we can't do, with respect to communications infrastructure, what we did with respect to traditional transportation infrastructure, like railroads and highways.
We're just about out of time, but another thing that has been part of this discussion about, or at least concerns from the government about net neutrality provisions, especially in light of this grant program. Do you hear from private firms that would be involved in this partnership, or that would be involved in broadband deployment, about those concerns? And are they concerned that their hands will be tied if those kind of provisions pass?
There are many private firms that are completely open to and comfortable with these provisions, which they have slightly different flavors in both bills, but what it might mean is an open platform over which multiple private firms compete with each other, which would be in some ways an ideal scenario, that there's one big pipe, as it were, and competitors over that, and all of those competitors don't have the enormous costs of building a network. They just have the costs of leasing some capacity and competing over the network. So many competitive providers and ISPs and smaller companies are thrilled by this prospect, because it'll give them access to communications infrastructure that they haven't had in a number of years, since the FCC under the Bush administration closed many of these networks to competition and allowed the network owners to have a monopoly. Some of the bigger companies that do own their own networks are not happy with the prospect of these kinds of regulatory considerations, and those are rational business decisions on their part. But if we are valuing competition and open speech and open competition over a big platform, then these are considerations that are well thought of.
No one is forcing anybody to take taxpayer money. And if you do want to take taxpayer money, then there may be legitimate public interest rules that go along with that. So.
We have time for one more question.
Ask each of you, do you think President Obama's goal of universal broadband is in fact achievable? And if so, what sort of date would you hang on it?
I think I've learned better than to state dates. I think President Obama learned that one from President Bush. That's a very good question. I think it remains to be seen what the shape of the final stimulus is going to be and how fast the money can get pushed out. The quicker the better. But I would be hesitant to put a date until some of those details are fleshed out. That said, I would also just like to say I think goals are important. I don't think goals are industrial policy. I think articulating goals tells us where we need to be as a country.
And I think the President's goal of universal broadband is eminently doable. And if the Chinese can do it, and the Japanese can do it, and the Dutch, and the French, then certainly we Americans can. And what I would like to see is broadband throughout the United States, in rural areas, and bigger, better broadband, competitive urban and suburban broadband in our metro areas. And there's no reason to think that we couldn't do that in a number of years.
Joining us this week on the Communicators, Joanne Hovis, the National Association of Telecommunications Officers and Advisors, serves as a board member, also the president of Columbia Telecommunications Corporation, and Commissioner Sharon Gillet of the Massachusetts Department of Telecommunications and Cable. And in our questioning, Jeff Silva of RCR Wireless News. To all of you, thanks for being on.
Thank you.